Hey everyone, I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where we help you start thriving, growing churches for the next generation. Welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. We have an incredible episode today with my friend Josh Benadum. Josh is a pastor. He's a network leader in Orlando, Florida. He and his wife Mary serve Acacia House Churches and collaborate with Youth for Christ with Stadia Church Planting right here with us and Brave Future. But he's also the author of A Life That Leads, Pursuing Christ and Impacting Others. You're in for a treat. Let's welcome Josh Benadum. Well, I'm really excited. We have my friend Josh Benadum on the Church Planting Podcast today. Welcome, Josh, to the Church Planting Podcast.
Awesome to be here. Longtime listener and just thrilled to be on it.
Hey, Josh, you're a church planter, man. You're down in Orlando. Okay, why Orlando? And yeah, let's just start there. Why Orlando?
Well, my wife and I pastored in a large church setting for many years. And my wife and I, we have kind of our origin story begins with being a part of a campus house church movement. And we were really teenagers, we were just beginning to walk with God and in our college years. And so a long-term ambition of ours has been to get back to a place where we could do more of a grassroots from the ground up type model of church. And so we had that calling on us really ever since I'd say 2020. We really felt a strong call to go break ground and do something new. And when you ask the question, why Orlando? Honestly, I never saw myself living in Florida. I'd lived kind of around the Midwest and overseas, and I never imagined that that's where I would end up in Florida. But God just undeniably opened a door for us to come here. I mean, we had friends, we had family, we had people who were kind of talking to us about their vision. We realized we had a shared vision for what we wanted to do, and then the other things too. I mean, we just got excited about being near UCF, this large growing campus, the idea of being in a city which is really what I would say Orlando is, the city of becoming. It's in transition from what it was to what it will be, and it just seemed like the perfect place at the end of the day to start something new.
Okay, so yeah, you're not doing the traditional launch large, and I'm really excited for our listeners and watchers to hear just a bit of your story before we jump into talking about your new book. I'm seeing this more and more, and I'm more and more excited about it because I think it's one of the very bright futures of church startups and planting in the United States. It's been going on around the world forever and in the fastest growing places of church growth. Talk about the model, the modality of church planting that you and your wife are involved in.
Yeah, so we're doing a church of house churches, and the real premise behind what we're doing is, obviously there's a New Testament example that we're looking at, right? That, this is how, I think most of us know, this is how the early church multiplied and spread in its earliest days. However, it is an example, right? I would say that I'm not a purist about house churches or microchurches. But I do think there's a strong New Testament example. We have to at least ask ourselves why, right? Why did they do it that way? And while all models have strengths and weaknesses, I think some particular strengths of a microchurch or a house church model is that we have an ideal environment in many ways to live out New Testament principles of body life. We have a meaningful venue in which to empower people to be everyday leaders, and also we have the chance to form embedded communities that can then go into neighborhoods and hopefully reach people that prevailing model churches are not going to reach. And so I really see it as a complementary strategy to what many other churches are doing.
And so you're calling it a network of house churches. Is there a distinction between house churches and micro churches, or is it just a different word?
Somewhat. There can be. So this is actually the other world that I swim in. I help organize and lead an organization called Brave Future, which is it's an alliance of house church and microchurch movements around the United States. So it's like the Tampa Underground, if you're familiar there.
Yeah, of course.
And our church is very partnered with them. There's Jeff Vanderstelt out in Soma communities and whatnot. He's a good friend. Nice to
He's a good friend of mine.
But we're part of this kind of larger network and collective, which is Brave Future. And people do use different language, I think, to describe similar expressions of the church. Like there's the simple churches, the microchurch, the house church. I do think microchurch and house church are, I think if you wanted to use the Tampa Underground's parlance for this, a microchurch is a broader concept than a house church that includes a house church, but can also include many other things. Well, a house church is a little bit more fixed, I guess, in terms of like what it's aiming to be. The language that they would use, they would call a house church a distributive model microchurch, meaning that, house church is kind of a community of people who might have different callings and ministries, but they gather together for worship, community, and mission, right?
Okay.
That's how they would put it. Well, for them, a microchurch could also include something very much more narrow and mission specific. Like let's say a group of people facilitating a homeless ministry could be a microchurch, right? In their thinking. So, yeah, there is somewhat of a distinction between those terms, but they can also be somewhat interchangeable.
Okay, so do your house churches? Do you ever gather all of them together, or are they completely independent all the time?
We do. Our current rhythm is they're empowered environments. I mean, they're doing communion, they're baptizing people, they're doing all the things. All
the sacraments. Yeah,
yeah. We've commissioned those leaders and those churches to be their own environments, but we do have a governing elder board that then oversees the church as a whole. But mostly to the end of equipping leaders and supporting, coaching, and facilitating what's happening in those house churches. So that's one of our centralizing structures. We do have some sort of authority relationship, although it's looser than like I think a prevailing model church would have over its like small groups, for instance, right? But then twice a month right now, we're also gathering as a church. And so basically 2 Fridays a month, we have what we call a hub meeting where all the house churches get together. It's really just for the purpose of encouragement, connecting. It's a venue for us to speak to the whole church. I'll sometimes preach at those. We'll have people share testimonies. Sometimes we do baptisms, like had church-wide baptisms. Again, sometimes, not always, but that's currently our means of gathering as one church, even as we exist as a distributed network of house churches.
Well, let me ask you the question that, I think is on everybody's mind these days that are looking at micro and simple and house. And are you co-vocational, or do you receive a salary? How are you paying the bills of the church? And are you on salary? Yeah.
So I am on salary. When we first came down to do this, I fundraised for my wife and I. We fundraised to kind of cover ourselves for 2 years. Through our existing networks, just to be able to focus on starting the church. But we kind of built into our bylaws and even like our team dynamic. We're like, hey, listen, if we're going to discern after a couple of years if a full-time church planter, pastor, coach is really needed, and if the answer is not, and we're gonna make sure that that's a decision that can be made by sort of our core team, then I'll go get a different job, or I'll be co-vocational, bivocational.
Yep.
And so where things landed, basically things just grew really rapidly. So, we went from one house church to now 5 house churches in under 3 years. And, we've got a community now of, over 100 adults and like 40 kids.
Wow.
And so it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that we did need someone who could, preach at our larger meetings, be responsible for kind of coaching and equipping leaders. And so that is, being available for pastoring in different senses. And so I do take a salary from the church. And then I do some supplemental things. Like I actually am a church planter coach with Stadia. So I work with you guys.
Thank you for doing that. You're fantastic.
Yeah. No, it's a privilege. I really enjoy it. And then I also have a part-time role with Brave Future, like I mentioned, and coordinating that collective. So those are but the core of my income currently does come from the church.
Well, let me just say, Josh, let me just take a moment here to stop and pause and just say how proud I am of you and the work you're doing, because I do think this is a vital methodology of church planting. And I do mean vital in the United States in the decades to come. And so to see you going after it and blazing the trail, man, I'm just proud of you and your wife. So thanks for being the risk takers to go out and do that. All right. You have, and then let me just say congratulations on a new book, A Life That Leads, just came out recently. And what first of all led you to write your book? I mean, by the way, you can get this on Amazon and any place that any great books are sold. But what led you to write A Life That Leads?
Yeah, I would say, man, I mean, I feel like this is true for most people who write a book, that like it's the roots go back, right? It's a lot. There's a lot there. So I actually grew up on the mission field. My parents are still to this day missionaries in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. They established a mission hospital for the poor that actually also plants churches. They've been doing that now for over 25 years. And I kind of had my teenage years and before that in Cambodia. And so I actually remember, even before I was really deeply or authentically walking with the Lord as a high school student, I remember watching missionaries and also national leaders in the context of my parents' ministry. I remember watching, people who kind of came from nothing, emerging to have a real impact on the people around them. Like I always remember the story that there's this one Cambodian man we knew who, I mean, just as poor as could be. It was miraculous. He had AIDS from his previous life, and at one point his white blood cell count was 8. He had 8 white blood cells.
Dead.
Dead. But the Lord kept him alive for another 10 years. And he reached his whole village for Christ. He discipled his sons. And so I remember like seeing things like that. And it was as this early evidence of like, what God has done in this man's life is just the power, the obvious miraculous power of the Holy Spirit. And this ordinary guy, without any resources or even health, had an outsized impact on the world around him. So I remember seeing that. On the other end of the spectrum, I also remember seeing, missionaries flame out. I remember seeing, people I looked up to have moral falls and have to be taken off the mission field. And so, and then I went on in later years to be a pastor. A lot of my role was equipping lay leaders for a long time. And so I was coaching and training lay leaders. And same thing, we saw people flourish, and we saw some over time kind of lose their way. And so I think somewhere around 2020, I in a lot of ways, because of the pandemic, my life paused. And then I basically started consolidating the things that I felt like God had shown me all the way back to when I was a high school student, and just asking that question of, how is it that ordinary people, without even really the benefits of seminary training or maybe a podium of some kind to be on, like how can your average person's life unfold into like real deep spiritual impact, like leadership impact? That's like question number one. And question number two is, how is it sustained, right? How can people both be empowered but also go the long haul? And so that was really the thing that got me originally turning on this question. And I think I wrote the original manuscript for this book back in 2020.
Okay, so A Life That Leads. So this isn't just for leaders. This is for all followers of Jesus.
That's right. I mean, really my thesis, and I was actually just reading Letters to the Church by Francis Chan today, and he actually makes this exact same point, so there's nothing new under the sun. But part of my thesis is that leadership is for everyone. Like spiritual leadership is, if we define it correctly, if we define it as servant leadership, if we define it as not being necessarily linked to a title or a role. Obviously, there are leadership roles. There's important leadership roles that are ordained in the church. But if we define leadership as serving in the way of Jesus, as impacting others out of the ways that God is impacting us, then really leadership is for everyone, and it's something that everyone should aspire to.
Okay, so you open, as I read through your book, you start with forming a life that leads, but you get in some really the practices of a life that leads. Let's talk about a few of those practices. What are some that you go, hey, this is just like, you can't skip this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say you can't skip any of them, partially because.
Fair enough.
I mean, so that whole middle section of the book is all I did was I selected key qualities from the pastoral epistles. Right, I took stuff from Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3, and then what I did was I tried to take, like one chapter is called hospitable, for instance. And I tried to take that quality and I tried to expand it a bit and demonstrate like, hey, this is not as simple as just being like a nice person who keeps a tidy environment and can have people over for dinner. Like that's an act of hospitality, but that's the actual character quality of hospitality, which actually means to be a lover of strangers, right? That's the Greek word. Is way bigger, way further than just be having a nice home that you can bring people into, right? It's an attitude that permeates even what you're like when you're not at your home, and the way that we posture our churches and all those things. And so I first of all tried to elevate the definition of what the quality is to something that I think is more biblical and robust. The second thing I try to do in those chapters is then demonstrate like, hey, here's what this could really look like in someone's life if they developed it. And practically speaking, if you wanted to develop this quality, if you wanted to be more like Jesus in this way, what would you do, right? What would your next step be? Rather than just sort of waiting for it vaguely to come upon you through spiritual growth, how could you live into it? How could you walk into it? And
so I love this. I love this idea, the lover of strangers. That's in being hospitable. My wife and I we here in the city of Cleveland. We're still exploring, and so we were visiting some of the historical church buildings in Cleveland last week, and we came upon this very, very old Irish Catholic church, and in their basement they were unloading diapers, 2,500 diapers, and they ended up needing help. So my wife and I helped them unload it, and we discovered in Cleveland, Josh, there are 900 refugees families living in that area of Cleveland right now. 900 refugee families, and that's the perfect opportunity, right? The lover of strangers. How do we jump in on that mission and do that? One of the ones that caught my mind is this idea of developing merciful discernment. Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so that chapter is actually it's actually unpacking the word gentle. If you go again, same thing. You go into the Greek, you look at like what that word really means. And my favorite tidbit about that word is that is the way that like Aristotle and some of the other Greek philosophers like use that word, and they would often use it in relationship to like not being a black and white thinker, someone who's able to think in shades of gray and exercise like good judgment, right?
Man, we need to hear this today, don't we?
No, we do. And again, because the English word gentle often to us just carries that idea of like a soft disposition, right? Like kind of you're easy to be around, you're comforting, that kind of thing.
Right.
But really, again, I think that the true character quality, I mean, it does involve kindness, but it involves the ability to sort of to see things to see things as they are, to be able to take a situation, and on one hand to maintain wisdom, right, to understand the principles needed to see a situation correctly, but then also to see the situation individually for what it is, apart from anything else, to be able to recognize an exception, to be able to see. Yes, generally speaking, this is how you have to meet this kind of person, but this person's also a unique individual. And so how do we love them and meet them where they're at, right? And so that biblical gentleness has a lot, again, it's just more robust, right? And when we think of it that way, it's no longer just about the tone of voice we use when speaking to people. It's really how we view people and how we approach people in every part of our lives.
Okay, let's switch over and let's talking about cultivating consistent zeal, and that's another fascinating one for me. Yeah,
that's 1 Peter 5, right? That's eager to serve.
Yeah,
is the verse that we're looking at there, and yeah, honestly, my favorite writing on this ever is Charles Spurgeon has this chapter in his. I think I read it in the book Encounter to Spurgeon. That was like an organization of his lectures by Helmet. But he has a chapter called Earnestness. It's marring and it's maintenance. And he just talks about how the most. I think a quote from him in that chapter is he says the thing that I most associate with ministerial success is whether or not a preacher or a pastor is earnest, right? And I think that idea of being earnest, of being like sincerely excited and given over, like passionate. And again, it's not that we all have to like, scream when we preach or something like that, but there needs to be an authentic zeal that we cultivate, right? That we cultivate in prayer and in the quiet places when we're alone with God. And that zeal needs to be a true fire that burns and expresses itself in the different parts of our ministry, right? We can't just be dutiful. We can't just be, people that are kind of looking to just achieve balance over the course of our lives. Like we need to be people that burn and are ready to burn all the way down, right, for the cause of Christ. And again, that's not just for the Spurgeons. That's not just for the Prince of Preachers. That's not just, for the person who's especially expressive. It's a character quality, right? It's a disposition that needs to be there regardless of your personality if you're going to impact the world for Jesus.
And this is what gives us purpose. Every single person, regardless of what your vocational call may be, it's the zeal is that passion for Jesus, right? Lived out.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so the whole middle section is filled with these amazing principles, and we've just, touched on just a couple of them there. So you want to read through those. But then the last section is just gold, sustaining a life that leads, because we watch this all the time, people flaming out in moral failures. But it's not just that. It's people that get bored or they go, what is my purpose in life? Let's spend the last minutes of our time together kind of unpacking what does it mean to sustain a life that leads.
Yeah. So, in that part of the book, there's three major things I talk about. I talk about the balance between soul and skill, which is, the idea that the inner life, who we are internally matters, but God also is concerned with our competencies, right? And that an important part of character development is that we not only continue to grow in who we are and in the image of Jesus, but part of that is that we also need to improve and develop in our ability to then execute, essentially, right? To be able to then act on and effectually do the things that God has given us to do. And that is an important part of growing and developing. It's not enough for it to remain this sort of like vague internal principle. It has to work itself out in our lives. And that's an ongoing process, right? And so the other two chapters in that section, one is called Avoiding the Traps That Hinder Growth, which just recognizes the fact that it's just not a guarantee that we'll keep growing with God, right? We're like regression is real. Spiritual growth is something which is dynamic. It's not static. We don't just gain something only to have it forever. We have to keep. We need the new manna, right? We have to go and get it every day, and that's really one distinguishing mark of a mature person is that they know that, right? And that they live that way. Not taking for granted that, their previous ministry success, the previous character they've built, that's going to still be there and stand for something in 10 years. It's like, no, we're looking to the future. We're a future oriented people. We're expecting God to keep working in us. And so a lot of that chapter is just about a lot of that section is about, what are the pitfalls and then what are the common disciplines that can help us stay the course.
Well, let's talk about what are some of the common disciplines that can keep us moving forward.
Yeah, man. I think there's 5 of them in that chapter. But just to rattle some of them off, I think lifelong friendship is a big one that I put in there. That discipline of not just. I mean, on one hand, we're all going to have friends that are there in certain seasons of life and not in others because of circumstances. But I do think that people who really go the distance. You see this. I think Paul was like this. I think the lives of most leaders who went the whole course, you'll see this. They intentionally fight for and maintain true accountability, deep friendships. They maintain being known by people, again, and not just like new people, but there's a continuity of relationship that they fight for. And so I think that's one. There's a humility and a recognition that we need that kind of support in our lives. So committed friendship is one. Again, there's a bunch of them that I name. Gratitude is one. And some people, I've mentioned that one before, and some people have responded well, is gratitude really a discipline? And I think it absolutely is. Thanksgiving and gratitude is a discipline because life just gives you so many reasons to grow bitter. Life gives you so many reasons to become cynical and to to not be grateful, to have even the best things in our lives, we can take them for granted over the course of time. And it does require discipline to maintain a thankful heart. One of the guys who discipled me when I was a young Christian, I asked him one time, I said, "Hey, what do you think destroys the most Christian leaders in the long run?" Right. And this was a guy, he was in his 50s at the time. Now he's in his 70s. And I asked, I was like, what have you've been in pastoral ministry for, 40 years. I was like, 30 years at the time. I was like, what do you think destroys leaders, like the most leaders over time? And his answer to that question was, he said two things. He said bitterness and materialism.
Wow.
And he said, and the reason for that, he said, is because both of them grow by increments. They don't happen, all at the same time. They grow by increments. They can remain camouflaged for many years, but both of them subtly take your heart away from God and then lead to other sins. And he said, and so he's like, it's like cancer. It's like a cancer that slowly metastasizes. And he says, I think those are the two things that kill the most Christian leaders.
And so the antidote to those things is living a life of gratitude and being aware of that, practicing that as a discipline. All right, Josh Benadum, A Life That Leads. Josh, thanks so much for being on the Church Planting Podcast.
It's great to be here, Greg. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast. The Church Planting Podcast is part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.